My knees are a bit creaky, I'm sorry. So if you excuse me, I'll use the chair. Thanks very much for having me. And let's start with a question. Who thinks Brexit's going really well? Well, I can say that that is a unanimous decision here so far. And, I mean, for a sketch writer, I mean, it's been pure gold, really, Brexit. It's a tragedy for the country in my view, but in terms of material, it's been wonderful. Only recently, we had Angela Merkel, who was asked after a meeting with Theresa May, was she irritated by the fact that Britain hadn't actually said what end state of Brexit it wanted? And she said, no, I'm not irritated, I'm just curious. Which sounds sort of like a Tinder sort of dating app, doesn't it? Sort of Brexit curious. You know, I mean, we have a sort of, I mean, the cabinet can't even agree on what it wants at the moment. I mean, one of the main sort of reasons, you know, that nothing is happening is because Sir Boris Johnson and Michael Gove and David Davis want something fundamentally different from Theresa May, John Redwood, and people like Justin Greening, Greg Hands. And so, I mean, we are in a point of stasis. I mean, even though they went off to Chequers last week and they came back sort of saying, we've got this amazing thing. What we want is ambitious managed divergence. As somebody wittily said, it would probably be better called managed ambitious divergence, or MAD for short, because still nobody really knows what's going on. We are no clearer about what we actually, I mean, apart from the fact that we seem to want something that the EU isn't going to offer. But I mean, I am the Guardian sketch writer. I mean, it's a really, I mean, we've been talking about sort of new media. I mean, the sketch writer is about as old media as you can possibly get. I mean, the role of the sketch writer goes back, it's about 200 years of tradition. In fact, Charles Dickens started his career as a sketch writer before it all went tits up, basically. And I mean, obviously, you know, there is a sort of live presence online as well, but and that's become increasingly important. But what the sketch writer is, I mean, I'm there in a way to sort of, yes, to entertain, but it's sort of more than that as well. I've kind of looked on it as a kind of piece of satire as well. It's a way of holding sort of power to account in a way that a lot of lobby journalists actually can't. I mean, the way that political journalism works is that, I mean, you know, for readers to have trust in what is being reported, obviously they have to report accurately. So if Theresa May or Jeremy Corbyn says X, it gets reported that they've said X, even if you suspect that they are basically telling lies, really. And the pleasure of the sketch writer is that you can get beneath that. You can get to the kind of subtext, if you like. And to create a sort of version of truth that is sort of hyper surreal, and to tell the truth that is not immediately apparent in a news story, just by going inside their kind of mental processes. And I've been a sketch writer now for 4 years, and when I first started, I thought it might be a bit dull, to be honest. I thought, God, I'm going to be sitting in Parliament, sort of listening to bits and pieces, and it may not, you know. I mean, I've always been interested in politics. I did a politics degree, you know, I've always been politically engaged, but I did wonder whether sort of minutiae of being in Parliament and sort of listening to transport questions and sort of some MPs saying, can the minister update me on the progress of roadworks on the A303? That didn't sound terribly gripping. But things sort of really kind of caught fire with Brexit. And I mean, in a way, you know, the Maybot was a sort of spin-off of Brexit, but we have to sort of go back to sort of what's, you know, often in stories and in journalism, we sort of, everything is day to day, and you know, what's happening today is the only important bit. And what I think where journalism sometimes falls down is on joining the dots. Do you forget how you got there? So in a way, what I want to use the time today is to sort of join up some of these dots. Because how did we get there? How did we get to an EU referendum? Well, we go back to the wonderful David Cameron, basically. And I mean, he for years had become a sort of bit, he would be managing a coalition with the Lib Dems, and he was getting increasingly anxious about the right wing of the Eurosceptic wing of his party. UKIP was on the rise. Two MPs had defected. Douglas Carswell and Mark Reckless had both defected over to UKIP. And, you know, Dave knew that in May 2015 there was an election coming, and he needed to grab everyone together. So what he did was he said, okay, I will guarantee you an EU referendum, a referendum on Britain's membership of the EU. And he never actually thought that he would have to deliver on this, because he didn't think, I mean, all the polling was suggesting that there was going to be no clear majority again. And then Dave would have been possibly in a different coalition, or even maybe out of government. And maybe it would have been Labour. I mean, many people thought Labour, the SNP, and the Lib Dems could form some kind of coalition at that point before the 2015 election. And but it all worked rather too well for Dave, because to everyone's surprise, including his own, the Tories won an outright majority in May 2015. And that threw up some real problems for Dave, because suddenly he had to deliver this kind of Brexit referendum. And there's one thing you always have to remember about David Cameron, and that he was fundamentally quite lazy. And not necessarily a quality you're looking for in a prime minister, but then we've often had prime ministers with qualities we don't like. And Dave had initially said, I will guarantee you a referendum by the end of 2017. So theoretically, we could have had this referendum at the end of last year. That would have been well within the framework. That would have given him plenty of time to try and negotiate a proper deal with the EU, and it would have also given people a lot more chance to sort of marshal the arguments on both sides. But Dave just thought, I mean, this is where he basically comes from the slacker generation, I think, because Dave did some simple maths, and at the time after the election, the polling was suggesting that Remain were going to win hands down. It was going to be about 65-35. In other words, he thought, I don't really have to do any work here. I've just got to go through the motions, and then everything's going to be fine. So Dave did go through the motions. He went round the 27 different EU states, trying to get something, some leeway negotiated. He came back with nothing. I mean, and largely, I mean, and that's, in a sense, that has been a mistake of the EU as well. because the EU had seen the same polling and thought that Remain were going to win hands down, and therefore thought they didn't have to make any concessions to us whatsoever. If they'd known it was going to be this close, then maybe they might have done, panicked a bit more and, gone for a different option. But they didn't. So Dave came back from his tour of Europe with absolutely nothing, which he then said, this has been a fantastic result. Vote for me, vote for me. And then we'd had the referendum campaign, which was probably the most, it was absolutely glorious to sketch, I have to say, because it was sort of one car crash after another, really. Everywhere you looked, there was sort of something, there was a politician making a complete idiot of themselves, really, and sort of blatantly lying. But in terms of kind of political debate and open democracy, it was utterly dispiriting. And as we know, the polls closed up, and all sorts of things sort of happened that shouldn't have happened. Boris and Michael Gove had been told by the Treasury Select Committee, take down that £350 million sign off the bus, it is misleading. And they didn't, because they knew it had traction, and they knew that, excuse me, there was absolutely no way that they could be forced to. So they just sort of carried on doing it. The Remain camp gave out its own disinformation as well, which was sort of profoundly unhelpful. And for a variety of reasons, some of which are to do with sovereignty, some of which are to do with immigration, and some of which are people who just feel alienated from the political process and just wanted to give the establishment a kicking. Britain voted to leave the EU. And then here we had Dave again. During the referendum campaign, he had been repeatedly asked, so if the vote does go against you, will you be the person who sees through the Brexit process? Will you take Britain through it? Kiss the badge, said Dave. I'll be there. At 9:30 on the morning after the referendum, Dave, a tearful Dave, I have to say, I was there watching him, came out to say that, well, basically he was off. And like with so many things with Dave, he'd got the timing even of his resignation wrong, because he'd delayed an hour, by which time the stock markets had opened. The markets were in free fall, and sterling lost 20%. So that was his last gift to the nation, really, was a 20% loss, a devaluation in sterling. It may have happened anyway. But then we came to, the most curious Tory leadership campaign of all time. And this again was a glorious time to be alive as a sketch writer, I have to say. Because, everybody thought, okay, Boris is going to run. And then just before Boris announced his candidacy, Michael Gove stabbed him in the back and said, I don't think he's the right person. And the weird thing is that Boris just crumpled at this. The mechanics or the mathematics of the actual Tory party leadership campaign is that the MPs got to vote down until the final two, and then the final two would have gone to a ballot of the Tory party membership. And I think Boris would have made it to the final two regardless of Michael Gove, and I suspect he might have won anyway, but I think that at heart he is such a narcissist that it was so wounding for him that he couldn't actually contemplate the thought of this kind of rejection, and he just sort of bottled it. So then we were left with Stephen Crabb, remember him, Liam Fox, Michael Gove, Andrea Leadsom, and Theresa May. Stephen Crabb and Liam Fox were the first to go. Stephen Crabb, because nobody knew who he was, and Liam Fox, because everyone knew who he was. And then Michael Gove was the next to go because, well, basically nobody could trust him, not even to knife himself by that point. So then we had sort of Andrea Leadsom and Theresa May as the sort of final two candidates. And I mean, this was a kind of extraordinary moment as well because, I mean, nobody had really heard of Andrea Leadsom. And very quickly we discovered why. Because she turned out to be kind of, she started sort of making speeches about as a mother, and which sort of didn't go down too well with a lot of people who don't have children and who don't think having children is necessarily a prerequisite of being a good prime minister. And I mean, she also, I was at this wonderful event that she did. I got this sort of note through that she was due to make a big speech about the economy. So I thought better go along and cover that. It turned out to be 20 minutes in which she didn't mention the economy once. I mean, but this was just sort of some of the nonsense. And anyway, then she sort of backed out. And then we were left with Theresa May became leader of the Tory party and prime minister, basically by doing nothing and saying nothing. It is the most bizarre way to, I mean, normally you have to campaign quite hard, but no, Theresa May just sat on her hands and just waited for all her rivals just to sort of disappear into the ether. It was kind of pure theatre. And I mean, it probably won't surprise you as a sort of Guardian writer that I'm not pro-Brexit and I'm not pro-conservative. But even I felt that Theresa May, I felt a sort of slight surge of relief. I did have to say it immediately because I kind of thought, well, Brexit is a big deal for the country. It is going to happen. And Theresa May, to me, looked like the only grown-up left in the room. And, you know, and what became quite interesting thereafter was the way that she got sort of built up, especially a lot, I think, by the right-wing media, as this kind of really strong woman who was sort of capable, commanding, who knew what she was doing. And this is where being a sketch writer sort of plays into hands, because I observe her sort of close up in the House of Commons when she had Prime Minister's Question Time, also during when she's out on stump making speeches. She had been she really hadn't been terribly good, and I kind of, you know, everyone was being told here was this sort of fantastically strong woman. And I saw this sort of someone who just sort of muttered sound bites and inanities. And in fact, it was in November 2016 that I first christened her the Maybot in a sketch. That's one of the other things about being a sketch writer, is that you get licensed to sort of, you know, invent your own characters. And I just found that the way that she kind of spoke, sort of robotically, Brexit means Brexit, you know, I mean, that meant nothing. But, I mean, but, you know, for a lot of people, that was all that was required. And and you would ask her, you know, what do you think about this? And she said, I am determined to be determined, would be the sort of level of her kind of political analysis. So I called her the Maybot at this stage. I also tried out various other sort of names for her as well. I called her the Supreme Leader at one time, and also Kim Jong-may was another one. Because I felt that way. Kim Jong-may sort of stuck really until the general election. Because Kim Jong-may kind of, to me, it sort of summed up everything about her, that she was in a way the supreme leader of a failed state, which is sort of how I kind of saw it. And every time that she was given an option, she seemed to make the wrong judgment to me. I mean, she challenged, she was taken to court over refusing to allow Parliament to vote on triggering Article 50. That was the sort of huge act of sort of self-harm to her, because the Labour Party had already said, we will back you in triggering Article 50. It was never in doubt in parliamentary numbers. I mean, Parliament was going to vote by about sort of 550 to 100, to trigger Article 50. But she refused to do it. And then she had the humiliation of losing in the Supreme Court. And then again, we had the nonsense of triggering Article 50 back in March last year. Again, this was more of a sop to her backbenchers because she still had no Brexit plan. I mean, the whole point about Article 50, as far as the EU was concerned, was that it was a 2-year process for a very good reason, and that was because the 2 years is almost impossible to negotiate anything in. And the EU had sort of deliberately devised it to try and, because they thought that anybody sane would take one look at the process and think, oh, we're going to stay in the EU, because leaving it's far too difficult. But she sort of then left off, she sort of rushed off and triggered Article 50 without any real notion of what she was going to do about it. And then we had the most bizarre general election campaign of all time. I mean, having triggered Article 50, you might have thought that her first priority would be to try and work out what she's going to do. No, it was, she wanted to go and get a kind of mandate from the country. And I mean, this was another act of kind of colossal self-harm. I mean, she was true. For some reason, she chose to make the whole campaign presidential. I mean, normally in an election campaign, cabinet ministers are allowed out from time to time. And the only time that a cabinet minister came out with her once was she did a joint press conference with Philip Hammond. And it was no secret that there was not much love lost between them. And everybody thought that, if Theresa May was going to win, then she was going to sack him. And she was asked, is the Chancellor going to be out of a job? And she refused to answer it. I mean, there was a man who was getting his P45 live on TV. It was an extraordinary kind of piece of ill-managed theatre. And then she sort of started saying strong and stable. The whole time, so that was her answer to everything. It was just utterly bizarre. And it was around this time too that, I mean, this is where, the kind of sketch writer feels vindicated, because I'd been calling her the Maybot for about 6 months. But now, other papers began to call her the Maybot. The Sun called her the Maybot. The Times called her the Maybot. And The Spectator did a fantastic illustration on the front cover of a Maybot. It was so good that we used it for the cover of my book. And they called her the Maybot in print. I mean, so it sort of became this sort of narrative. I mean, but even with all that and the kind of futility of the Tory party manifesto, which was an absolute disaster. Do you remember the dementia tax? Yep, that was her idea. How to alienate your core voters. Most Tory voters are sort of over 35. Go for them and make them suggest that they're all going to be broke when they go, if they get dementia. I mean, not a great look, really. And we had this sort of election result where she came back with as a minority party, I mean, a diminished figure. And it was, and she's been diminished ever since, really. We are in this really bizarre state. I mean, it's my own feeling that she actually wanted to resign the day after the election. I was outside Downing Street at the time, and I could see that this was a woman who had had enough. She was, it was the humiliation was complete. But, I mean, the fact is that there was no obvious person to take her place. I mean, everybody else was, sort of kryptonite, really. And there was no one. So her punishment for failure was to stay on. I mean, that is a kind of cruel and unusual punishment by any standard. And, things are just sort of continued to sort of go wrong for her. I mean, do you remember her Tory party conference speech? I mean, this was meant to be her great big relaunch of herself. So her mea culpa to the Tory party. I'm sorry for getting this wrong. She even said, I'm sorry, my style was too scripted. She said, reading from a script. I mean, you can. But then, if you remember, the comedian Simon Brodkin came up on stage and gave her a P45, and she accepted it. She did, because in her heart of hearts, that's what she really wanted, I think. I mean, this was kind of relief. Oh, thank you. And then she got, I think she was sort of overwhelmed by this sort of sense of, it was a sort of narcissistic breakdown, really, because having been speaking quite well, she suddenly got this coughing fit. She just could not stop coughing. She got this big frog in her throat. And every time and it was sort of painful to watch, and people were sort of virtually applauding out of sympathy just for getting to the end of a sentence. And then, the ultimate humiliation was when the frog leapt out of her throat, ran across the stage, and started knocking letters off the bits of the screen behind her. Really, her world was falling apart around her. And it sort of has been ever since. We have reached where we are in the Brexit negotiation. We've passed stage one. But, we are still, I think, as lost as ever. She's due to make a big speech on Friday, which I think will tell us nothing, because there is no solution to the Northern Ireland. The big spanner in the works for a customs union and single market is Northern Ireland. And there is just absolutely no way anyone can work out how to have frictionless trade between Northern Ireland and Republic of Ireland without staying in the single market and customs union. And today, again, I can tell you advance notice, the sketch tomorrow is going to be Boris Johnson's performance on Today programme today. I don't know if anybody heard him, but he basically compared the Northern Ireland Republic of Ireland border as the same as going from Camden to Westminster. That is our Foreign Secretary, and that's the state of our politics today. Thank you.
Brilliant, John. Thank you so much. It's absolutely brilliant. I have one question for you, maybe even two questions.
Go on then.
So do you think Theresa May's going to make it to the next election?
No, I don't. My feeling is that what will happen is that she will make it to the middle of 2019, by which stage we will have negotiated some kind. We will have officially left the EU on March the 30th, or March the 29th at 11 o'clock, I think it is. And we will have some kind of transitional deal, and there will be some kind of negotiation. But it won't be, it'll all be as clear as mud. And I think that what will happen then is that over the course of the summer, the Tories will mount a coup against her, or she will resign, because they'll try and go into the next general election with a new Prime Minister, someone who isn't tainted by Brexit, if you like. So they'll try and rebuild their brand as sort of one of sort of competent. So it won't be any of the sort of, Boris has had his day, Michael Gove's had his day, Philip Hammond's had his day. It'll be someone more left field than that, I think.
Shall watch that space. Anyone else got any questions quickly? One right in the middle.
Who have been the your favourite political sketch writers of your life?
Well, I mean, I have to pay tribute to my predecessor, Simon Hogarth. He was absolutely, for me, he sort of set the gold standard, really. And I kind of, when I took over the job, I was very, very conscious of having something to live up to, if you know what I mean. And I also sort of didn't know, it took me a while to sort of to work out what my own voice was going to be. I didn't want to end up sort of, in a way, becoming a sort of parody of Simon Hogarth, in a way. So, in fact, one of the first things I did, one of Simon's great pleasures in life was teasing a Tory MP called Michael Fabricant, who, for all of those of you who don't know him, he's a sort of rather sort of gobby backbencher for MP for Lichfield, who has this sort of orange Elton John wig, which he would always make reference to. And I decided that sort of, in a way, out of homage to Simon, that I was going to retire Michael Fabricant from the sketch and just sort of, just drop him, and so that he would never appear again. And I did hear, actually, that after a year of this, it got back to me that Michael Fabricant was very upset to have been dropped from the sketch, which just merely goes to show that sort of MPs are so vain and so narcissistic that they would rather be written about critically and comedically than not be written about at all. And the other thing about the sketch is when people say, don't I make enemies? Well, I don't know. I mean, perhaps I do, perhaps I don't. I mean, I make a point of not getting too close to politicians. But you always have to remember in Westminster, if you're rude about one politician, you've made 649 other friends.
And I think, actually, on that note, we should draw a close. Thank you very much.
Thank you.